My cheating wife was secretly planning to divorce Maine and take everything, so I gathered evidence of. Have you ever done something you thought was a good deed, only to have it come back and change your entire life? That's how Edward's story begins, a story that would twist and turn in ways he never imagined. Edward Lowell, a quiet and focused businessman in his early 30s, never thought marriage was in the cards for him. He was dedicated to his career and methodical about every decision. But Amelia Young changed everything. She wasn't just beautiful, she was smart and confident and carried a warmth that made people feel like they belonged, the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking in. They met under unusual circumstances. Amelia, fresh out of law school, was working on a high-profile case involving Edward's father. It was a mess, accusations flying, the family name dragged through the mud. Amelia's sharp mind and relentless work uncovered the truth, clearing Edward's father of all charges. For Edward, it was more than a legal victory. It felt personal. Amelia didn't just save his father, she saved his family's legacy. Gratitude turned into admiration, and admiration into something deeper. Within months, Edward and Amelia were inseparable. Their whirlwind romance became the talk of their circle. Friends called them the perfect couple. They looked happy, successful, and completely in sync. But as the saying goes, not everything that shines is gold. At first, Amelia felt like she was living in a dream. Edward had a way of making her feel safe. He wasn't overly expressive, but when he looked at her, it was as if she were the only person in the world. She thought, this is it. This is the man I want to spend my life with. But over time, she noticed little things that in hindsight were warning signs. Edward was a man of routine. His work came first. Amelia understood that she was ambitious too, but there were days when she'd sit across from him at dinner, sharing stories about her day, only to realize he hadn't heard a word. His mind was elsewhere, on business, on problems he hadn't solved yet. He would smile, nod, and say the right things, but it always felt hollow. The breaking point came in small moments, like when she spent hours planning a romantic weekend getaway, only for Edward to cancel at the last minute because of an unexpected work trip, or the time she poured her heart out about her struggles starting her own business, only for Edward to respond with a suggestion about hiring better staff. To make matters worse, Edward's world came with baggage. Olivia Rayner, a former girlfriend, was still part of his life. At first, Amelia didn't think much of her. Olivia seemed harmless, a figure from Edward's past who occasionally popped up at social events. But there was something about the way Edward spoke to Olivia, the way he looked at her, that made Amelia's stomach twist. It was subtle but unmistakable. Amelia tried to ignore it. She told herself she was paranoid and that Edward would never betray her trust. But the doubt lingered. It grew stronger every time Olivia's name came up, every time Edward mentioned a meeting or call with her. Deep down, Amelia felt like she was competing for Edward's attention and losing. Olivia wasn't just a lingering shadow, she was a storm cloud hanging over their marriage. She was ambitious, sharp-tongued, and as Amelia would later discover, carrying Edward's child. But for now, Amelia didn't know that. All she knew was that Olivia's presence made her feel like a second choice, a placeholder. Even so, Amelia tried to make it work. She loved Edward truly. She believed in their marriage and the vows they had taken. But love, when unreciprocated, starts to feel like a weight, and Amelia, for all her strength, was starting to break under it. On the surface, they looked like the perfect couple. Friends would comment on how lucky they were to have each other. Amelia would smile and nod, playing along with the charade. But inside, she felt like a stranger in her own life. The warmth and connection she once felt with Edward had been replaced by silence and distance. One night, as she lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, Amelia asked herself a question she never thought she'd ask. What if this is all there is? The thought terrified her. She had built her life around Edward, around the idea of a future with him. But the cracks in their relationship were becoming too big to ignore. Still, Amelia wasn't ready to give up. She held on to hope, believing that if they just talked, if they just tried, they could fix things. She planned a dinner, just the two of them, at their favorite restaurant. She rehearsed what she wanted to say, choosing her words carefully to avoid sounding accusatory. But when the night came, Edward was distracted. His phone buzzed every few minutes with work emails. He barely touched his food. When Amelia finally worked up the courage to bring up her feelings, Edward dismissed them with a casual, "We're fine, Amelia. You're overthinking things." That was the moment Amelia realized she was alone in her marriage, and for the first time she wondered if Edward even noticed. Edward wasn't blind to what was happening. He could see that Amelia was pulling away, but instead of confronting the issue, he buried himself deeper in work. He convinced himself that as long as he was providing for her, everything would be okay. After all, wasn't that what a good husband was supposed to do? But deep down, he knew he was failing her. Meanwhile, Amelia started questioning everything. She wondered if their marriage had been built on something real, or if it was all just a mirage, a fleeting connection that couldn't stand the test of. And while she wasn't ready to leave, the thought had crossed her mind more than once. What Amelia didn't know was that Edward had his own doubts. He worried that he wasn't enough for her, that she deserved someone who could give her the attention and affection he struggled to show. But instead of opening up, he kept his fears to himself, creating an emotional chasm that grew wider with each passing day. And then there was Olivia, the storm brewing in the background, ready to unleash its fury. For now her presence was just a shadow, but soon she would become the catalyst for everything to unravel. Cracks in the foundation. Sometimes relationships fall apart not because of big, explosive arguments, but because of the quiet moments when one person feels unseen. That was exactly how Amelia felt as the months turned into years in her marriage with Edward. The man she had once admired, the one who had made her feel like the center of his world, now seemed like a stranger. And the worst part, Edward didn't even seem to notice. Amelia tried to brush it off at first. It's just a phase, she told herself. Every marriage has ups and downs, but the downs started to feel like the new normal. She would wake up to an empty bed, Edward already downstairs in his office, buried in work. When he was home, he was present in body but not in spirit. His mind was always elsewhere. The disconnect wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. The lingering touches, the spontaneous kisses, things that had once been second nature, were now gone. Amelia found herself wondering, does he still love me? Or am I just someone he lives with? The turning point came during their 3rd anniversary. Amelia had gone out of her way to plan something special. She booked a table at the restaurant where they had their first date, bought a dress she knew Edward would love, and even wrote him a heartfelt letter. But Edward, he forgot. He walked into the house that evening, phone in hand, eyes glued to the screen. "Hey," he said absent-mindedly, dropping his bag on the floor. "What's for dinner?" Amelia stared at him, waiting for a flicker of recognition to cross his face. It never came. "You don't remember, do you?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but trembling with hurt. "Remember what?" Edward replied, genuinely confused. "Our anniversary," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. 3 years, Edward. 3 years today." Edward's face fell, and for a moment, Amelia thought he might apologize. But instead, he said, "Amelia, I'm sorry. Work has been insane lately. You know, I didn't mean to forget." That was the moment Amelia realized something important. She wasn't angry that Edward had forgotten. She was hurt because it didn't even seem to matter to him. Over the next few weeks, Amelia tried to rekindle the spark. She suggested they take a weekend trip, just the two of them. Edward agreed, but when the time came, he canceled at the last minute, citing an important client meeting. Amelia tried writing him notes and leaving them in his briefcase, little reminders of their love. She never got a response. Then came Olivia Rayner. Amelia had always known about her. Edward had mentioned her in passing as an old friend who sometimes reached out for advice. But lately Olivia's name had started to come up more often. Edward would casually drop it into conversation. Olivia said this, or Olivia thought that. Each time, it was like a tiny pinprick in Amelia's heart. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that Olivia wasn't just an old friend. There was a familiarity in the way Edward spoke about, a fondness that made Amelia feel like an outsider in her own marriage. One night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Edward's phone buzzed. He picked it up, smiled, and started typing a reply. Amelia couldn't help herself. "Who's that?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Just Olivia," Edward said, not even looking up. Amelia felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but she held back. She didn't want to come across as the jealous, insecure wife. But deep down, she was both. As the weeks went by, Amelia noticed more things that didn't sit right. Edward would leave for work earlier than usual, claiming he had meetings sometimes. He wouldn't come home until late, offering vague explanations about client dinners. Amelia started to feel like she was living with a stranger, someone whose life she only got to observe from the outside. One night, unable to sleep, Amelia decided to look through Edward's calendar. She wasn't proud of it, but she needed to know if she was imagining things or if there was something he wasn't telling her. And that's when she saw it, a recurring meeting with Olivia Rayner, scheduled every Thursday at 3 p.m. Her heart sank. Amelia wanted to confront Edward right then and there, but she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if it was just work-related? But the nagging doubt wouldn't go away. The next morning, Amelia tried to act normal, but Edward noticed something was off. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Amelia forced a smile. "I'm fine," she said, brushing past him, but inside she was anything but fine. The tension between them grew thicker with each passing day. Edward seemed oblivious, but Amelia was unraveling. She started to withdraw, spending more time at the office and less time at home. Her coworkers noticed the change. "You okay, Amelia?" one of them asked gently. "You seem distracted lately." "I'm fine," Amelia repeated, the same lie she had told Edward. But she wasn't fine. She was scared. Scared that her marriage was slipping through her fingers. Scared that the man she loved was no longer the man she married. And then one evening she overheard a phone call. Edward was in his office, the door slightly ajar. Amelia wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the sound of Olivia's name stopped her in her tracks. "Yes, Olivia, I understand," Edward was saying, his voice low. "I'll take care of it, don't worry." Amelia's blood ran cold. Take care of what? And why did he sound so protective? She backed away from the door, her mind racing. For the first time, Amelia considered the possibility that Edward might be hiding something, and not just anything, something that could change everything. A heartbreaking discovery. Trust is a fragile thing. Once it's broken, it's hard to piece back together, and for Amelia, the cracks in her trust were spreading fast. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the first real blow landed. Edward had left for one of his meetings with Olivia. Amelia, sitting in her office at work, couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting to the same question: what were they really meeting about? Was it just business, or was there something more? She tried to shake the thought and bury herself in work, but it was useless. Her curiosity and her fear won out. On a whim, she decided to drive by the coffee shop Edward had mentioned. He wasn't expecting her, and she wasn't sure what she was hoping to find. Maybe she just wanted to see for herself. When Amelia arrived, she spotted them almost instantly. Edward and Olivia were sitting at a corner table. At first glance, it looked innocent enough, two people talking over coffee. But then Amelia noticed the way Olivia leaned in, touching Edward's hand as she laughed. It wasn't the gesture of a colleague. It was something else. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to march over there and demand answers, but her legs felt like lead. Instead, she stood frozen, watching as Edward smiled at Olivia in a way he hadn't smiled at her in years. The drive home was a blur. Amelia's thoughts raced, each one more painful than the last. Was she being paranoid, or had she just seen the truth? She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, dissecting every detail. Edward's smile, Olivia's touch, the way they seemed so comfortable together, it all felt like confirmation of her worst fears. That evening, Amelia didn't say a word to Edward. She couldn't. The image of him with Olivia was burned into her mind. Edward, for his part, acted as if nothing had happened. He came home, kissed her on the cheek, and asked about her day. Amelia wanted to scream, to confront him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she retreated to the bedroom, the weight of her silence suffocating. The following week, Amelia began to notice more things that didn't add up. Edward's phone was suddenly always on silent, and he kept it close, even taking it with him to the bathroom. His schedule became more erratic, with more late nights and early mornings. And then there were the calls, muffled conversations behind closed doors that ended the moment Amelia walked in. One night, unable to take it anymore, Amelia decided to look through Edward's phone. She waited until he was asleep, her hands trembling as she reached for it. But when she tried to unlock it, she discovered he had changed the passcode. A new wave of hurt washed over her. Edward had never hidden his phone before. Why now? Desperate for answers, Amelia turned to the one person she thought might know the truth, her best friend, Claire. Over coffee, she poured out everything: the distance between her and Edward, the meetings with Olivia, the coffee shop incident, the phone. Claire listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and anger. "Amelia, you can't keep living like this," Claire said firmly. "You need to talk to him, demand answers. If he's hiding something, you deserve to know." "But what if I'm wrong?" Amelia whispered, her voice breaking. "What if it's all in my head?" Claire reached across the table, squeezing Amelia's hand. "You're not wrong," she said softly. "Your gut is telling you something, and you need to trust it." That night, armed with Claire's words, Amelia resolved to confront Edward. She rehearsed what she wanted to say, how she would ask about Olivia without sounding accusatory. But when Edward came home, she lost her nerve. His smile, his casual demeanor, it threw her off. How could someone who might be lying act so normal? Instead of confronting him, Amelia decided to wait for proof. She started keeping a closer eye on Edward, noting his comings and goings, his calls and messages. She hated feeling like a spy in her own marriage, but the doubt gnawed at her. She needed answers, even if they hurt. Her breaking point came 2 weeks later. Edward had another late-night client dinner, leaving Amelia alone in the house. Restless and unable to sleep, she wandered into his office. As she looked around, her eyes fell on his laptop. It was open, the screen glowing softly in the dark. Amelia hesitated for a moment, then sat down and opened his email. What she found made her stomach drop. There were dozens of messages from Olivia, some professional, but others far too personal. One, in particular, caught her eye. It was from 3 days ago, titled Last Thursday. Amelia clicked it, her hands trembling. The message was short but devastating. Thank you for meeting me. I don't know what I'd do without you. You always make me feel like everything will be okay. She stared at the words, her vision blurring with tears. There was no denying it now. Edward wasn't just meeting Olivia for work. He was comforting her, supporting her in a way he no longer did for Amelia. When Edward came home that night, Amelia was waiting for him in the living room. Her face was pale, her hands clenched into fists. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold and steady. Edward looked at her, startled by her tone. "What's going on?" Amelia held up her phone, where she had taken a picture of Olivia's email. "This," she said, her voice breaking. "What is this, Edward? And don't you dare lie to me." For the first time, Edward's confident facade cracked. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. Was it the decision to fight? It's often said that the moment you feel the most broken is when you discover how strong you really are. For Edward, that moment came when he realized he might lose everything. The night Amelia confronted him, Edward was caught off guard. He stood in the middle of their living room, staring at the email she had found. His mind raced, searching for an explanation that didn't sound like an excuse. But there was no getting around it. He had crossed a line, and now the damage was done. "Amelia," Edward began, his voice shaky, "it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Edward, Amelia shot back, her eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months. So go ahead, explain, I'm listening." Edward felt a knot form in his throat. He wanted to tell her the truth, but where would he even start? Olivia's reappearance in his life wasn't planned. She had reached out to him months ago, desperate for help. At first he had agreed to meet her out of a sense of obligation, but over time their meetings had become more frequent, their conversations more personal. He had convinced himself it was harmless, but now, standing in front of his furious wife, he saw just how wrong he had been. "Olivia. She needed help," Edward finally said. "She's been going through a lot, and I didn't want to burden you with it." Amelia let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, so you were protecting me? How noble of you. Did it ever occur to you that keeping secrets would hurt me more?" Edward looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he admitted. "I was just trying to do the right thing." "The right thing," Amelia's voice cracked. "You don't even see it, do you? You've been so busy playing the hero for her that you didn't notice you were abandoning me." Her words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He had always prided himself on being the kind of man who took care of the people he loved, but now he realized he had failed the one person who mattered most. For days after their fight, the house was eerily quiet. Amelia avoided Edward, retreating to the guest room and throwing herself into her. Edward, meanwhile, spent hours replaying their argument in his mind. He hated the man he had become, the man who let his marriage fall apart because he couldn't let go of his past. One night, unable to sleep, Edward found himself sitting in his office, staring at an old photo of him and Amelia. It was taken on their honeymoon, back when things were simple and they were happy. He barely recognized the people in the picture. What had happened to them? And more importantly, was there any way to fix it? As Edward sat there, a memory surfaced, something his father had once told him during one of their rare heart-to-heart conversations. "Son, there will come a time in your life when you have to decide what's worth fighting for. And when that time comes, don't hesitate. Fight with everything you've got." Those words echoed in Edward's mind as he picked up his phone and dialed Olivia's number. It was late, but he didn't care. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Edward? What's going on?" Olivia sounded surprised. "This has to stop," Edward said firmly. "I can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" Olivia asked, her tone defensive. "Feeding you, helping you, being there for you," Edward replied. "It's destroying my marriage, and I won't let that happen. I'm sorry, Olivia, but you need to find someone else to lean on." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Olivia sighed. "I never meant to cause problems for you, Edward. I didn't know who else to turn to." "I understand," Edward said, his voice softening. "But I can't be that person for you anymore. I need to focus on my wife, on my marriage." When Edward hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't a fix-all solution, but it was a start. He had made his decision. Now, he just had to prove to Amelia that he was willing to fight for her. The next morning, Edward woke up early and made breakfast, a small gesture, but one he hoped would show Amelia he was trying. When she came downstairs, she looked surprised to see him standing in the kitchen. "What's all this?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Breakfast," Edward said, offering her a tentative smile. "I thought we could eat together. Talk." Amelia hesitated for a moment before sitting down. As they ate, Edward opened up in a way he hadn't in years. He told her about his fears, his guilt, and the mistakes he had made. He didn't try to justify his actions, he simply apologized, sincerely and wholeheartedly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Edward said, his voice trembling. "But I need you to know that I love you, Amelia, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Amelia listened silently, her expression unreadable. When Edward finished speaking, she looked at him for a long moment before finally saying, "I don't know if I can trust you again, but I guess we'll see." It wasn't the answer Edward had hoped for, but it was a start. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. But what Edward didn't realize was that their problems were far from over. In the shadows, someone else was watching, someone who had no intention of letting Edward and Amelia rebuild their life together, and soon they would make their move. Amelia's new life and Marcus Hale. It's strange how quickly life can shift. One day you're fighting to hold on to something, the next you're wondering if it's even worth saving. That's where Amelia found herself in the weeks following her confrontation with Edward. She didn't leave right away. Part of her wanted to see if he would change, if his promises to fight for their marriage were more than just empty words. But deep down, a small voice whispered that it might be time to move on. Amelia didn't know if she was ready to listen to it, but she couldn't ignore it either. At work, Amelia found solace in the chaos. Her boutique content creation firm was growing steadily, and for the first time in months, she felt like she had control over something. Every new project, every satisfied client was a small victory, a reminder that she was capable of building something on her own. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. "You seem different," said Lisa, her assistant, one afternoon. "In a good way, I mean, like you're coming back to life." Amelia smiled faintly. "Thanks, Lisa. I guess I'm just focusing on what I can control right now." But there was one thing she couldn't control: her feelings. No matter how much she tried to push Edward out of her mind, he was always there, lingering in the background. Every time her phone buzzed, she half expected it to be him. And every time it wasn't, a small part of her felt disappointed. That's when Marcus Hale walked into her life. It happened on a Tuesday morning, during a routine client meeting. Marcus was an actor, a charming, confident man with a magnetic presence. He had been hired to star in a campaign Amelia's firm was managing, and from the moment they met, there was an undeniable spark. "Amelia Young, right?" Marcus said, extending his hand. "I've heard great things about you." "Likewise," Amelia replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. She wasn't used to being flustered, but something about Marcus threw her off balance. The meeting went smoothly, and Marcus's easygoing nature quickly won over the entire team. But it was his interaction with Amelia that stood out. He had a way of making her laugh, of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. After the meeting, Marcus lingered behind as the rest of the team filed out. "Hey, Amelia," he said casually, "do you have a minute?" "Sure," she replied, curious. "I just wanted to say, you're really good at what you do. It's impressive." Amelia smiled, a genuine smile that felt foreign on her face. "Thank you, Marcus, that means a lot." Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more often. At first, their conversations were strictly professional, but gradually they became more personal. Marcus had a way of asking questions that made Amelia open up, and before long she found herself sharing things she hadn't told anyone else. One afternoon, as they sat in a coffee shop discussing the campaign, Marcus leaned back in his chair and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Amelia said, sipping her latte. "What's your story? I mean, outside of work. You seem like someone with a lot of layers." Amelia hesitated. She wasn't used to talking about herself, especially not with someone she barely knew, but there was something about Marcus's sincerity that made her want to answer. "It's complicated," she said finally. "I'm going through some things right now." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Aren't we all? But hey, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm a good listener." "Thanks, Marcus," Amelia said, her voice soft. "I'll keep that in mind." As the weeks passed, Amelia found herself looking forward to her interactions with Marcus. He was funny, kind, and unfiltered in a way that was refreshing. But more than that, he reminded her of what it felt like to be appreciated not just as a professional, but as a person. One evening, after wrapping up a late-night brainstorming session, Marcus walked Amelia to her car. The parking lot was quiet, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows. "Thanks for staying late," Amelia said, unlocking her car door. "I know you probably have better things to do." "Not really," Marcus said with a grin. "Besides, I like spending time with you." Amelia felt her cheeks flush again. "Marcus, I'm not trying to make things weird," he added quickly. "I just think you're amazing, Amelia, and I hope you know that." For a moment, Amelia didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure if she was ready for something new, but Marcus's words stirred something in her, a tiny flicker of hope. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That means more than you know. As Amelia drove home that night, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't deny that she was drawn to Marcus, but the thought of moving on from Edward felt overwhelming. Could she really let go of the life they had built together? Was she ready to take a leap into the unknown? The following morning, Amelia found a note from Edward on the kitchen counter. It was simple, just a few lines thanking her for giving him a second chance and promising to keep fighting for her. Her heart ached as she read it. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he could change, but could she ignore the part of her that was starting to wonder if it was time to move on? Amelia knew she couldn't avoid the decision forever. At some point she would have to choose: fight for the marriage she once believed in or embrace the possibility of something new. For now, though, she was content to let the question linger, hoping the answer would come to her in time. Unbeknownst to Amelia, someone else was watching her every move. Victor Lowell, Edward's estranged half-brother, had returned, and he had a plan, one that would turn Amelia's life upside down. But for now she remained blissfully unaware, caught between the past and the future. Enter Victor Lowell. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. For Edward and Amelia, that curveball came in the form of Victor Lowell, a name Edward hadn't spoken in years, but could never forget. Victor was Edward's half-brother, though the term brother never felt quite right. They had grown up in the same house but lived entirely different lives. Victor, the elder by 4 years, had always been the rebel, the black sheep of the family, while Edward followed in their father's footsteps, striving for success and respectability. Victor seemed determined to burn every bridge he crossed. The last time Edward had seen Victor was over a decade ago, during a heated argument that ended with Victor storming out of the family estate. He had vowed never to return, and for years he kept that promise. Edward had assumed Victor was gone for good, living somewhere far away, wreaking havoc in someone else's life. But Victor wasn't gone. He was watching, and now he was ready to make his move. It started with a phone call. Edward was in his office, sifting through paperwork, when his assistant buzzed in. "There's a man here to see you," she said hesitantly. "He says his name is Victor." Edward froze. For a moment he thought he had misheard. "Victor," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes, sir. Should I send him away?" Edward hesitated. Part of him wanted to say yes, to tell her to escort Victor out and slam the door on the past, but curiosity got the better of him. "Send him in," he said finally, his stomach churning. When Victor walked through the door, Edward barely recognized him. The once lean and wild-eyed young man had transformed into someone older, harder, and more dangerous-looking. His sharp features were marred by a faint scar on his cheek, and his eyes held a glint of something Edward couldn't quite place: anger, perhaps, or maybe satisfaction. "Hello, little brother," Victor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Miss me?" "What are you doing here?" Victor Edward asked, keeping his tone as steady as possible. Victor smirked. "Is that any way to greet family? I thought you'd be happy to see me." Edward didn't reply. Instead, he studied Victor carefully, searching for clues about why he had resurfaced after all these years. He didn't have to wait long. "I hear things are going well for you," Victor continued, strolling around the office like he owned the place. "Big house, successful business, a beautiful wife. You've got it all, don't you?" "What do you want?" Edward asked, cutting to the chase. Victor chuckled, straight to the point. "I like that. What I want, dear brother, is what I'm owed." Edward's brow furrowed. "What you're owed? I don't owe you anything, Victor." "Don't you?" Victor's voice dropped, his tone turning icy. "Our father's empire, everything he built, you think it's all yours? You think you can just erase me from the family and move on like I never existed?" Edward clenched his fists. "You left, Victor. You made your choices. And now I'm back to collect." Victor shot back. "You've had your time in the sun, Edward. Now it's my turn." Victor's words sent a chill down Edward's spine. He knew his brother well enough to understand that this wasn't an idle threat. Victor had always been cunning, manipulative, and dangerously resourceful. If he was making demands, it meant he had already started putting his plan into motion. "What are you planning?" Victor Edward asked, his voice low and steady. Victor's smirk widened. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough, but don't worry, I'll make sure it's memorable." Before Edward could respond, Victor turned and walked out, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. Edward sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's return was only the beginning of something far more sinister. While Edward grappled with Victor's sudden reappearance, Amelia remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the background. She was too caught up in her own struggles, navigating her complicated feelings for Edward, her growing connection with Marcus, and her efforts to find a sense of independence. But Victor had plans for Amelia too. To him, she wasn't just Edward's wife, she was leverage, a pawn he could use to get what he wanted. He began watching her from afar, learning her routines, her habits, and the people she trusted. Victor had always been a master at exploiting weaknesses, and he was certain he had found Edward's greatest one, Amelia. One evening, as Amelia was leaving her office, she felt a strange sensation, a prickle at the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. She glanced around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking off the feeling, she headed to her car, unaware that Victor was watching her from the shadows. Back at home, Edward was consumed by his thoughts. He hadn't told Amelia about Victor's visit. He wasn't sure how to explain it without alarming her, but deep down he knew he couldn't keep it a secret forever. Victor wasn't the type to back down, and whatever he was planning, it was only a matter of time before it spilled into their lives. As Edward stared out the window, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple but chilling. "You should have welcomed me back, little brother. Now you'll regret it." Edward's heart sank. Victor wasn't just back, he was already making his move. Escalation of threats. Some threats are loud and obvious, others creep in quietly, like shadows stretching in the evening light. For Edward and Amelia, Victor's threats started subtly, but they quickly grew impossible to ignore. It began with small, unsettling signs. Edward noticed documents disappearing from his office, contracts, financial statements, and private correspondence. At first he thought it was a mistake, that his assistant had misplaced them. But then one morning he found a note on his desk. The handwriting was unmistakable. It read, "I told you, Edward, this is just the beginning." Edward's heart raced as he read the note. He knew it was from Victor. It was a message, proof that Victor had access to his office, to his life. But how? And why hadn't he noticed until now? Edward clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He couldn't let Victor gain the upper hand, but confronting him head-on felt like walking into a trap. That evening, Edward installed new security measures at his office. He changed the locks, updated the alarm codes, and hired a private investigator to look into Victor's movements. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was always one step ahead. While Edward was grappling with Victor's silent war, Amelia began to feel the effects too, though she didn't realize it at first. It started with strange phone calls, unknown numbers that hung up as soon as she answered. Then there were the emails. At first they seemed like spam, but as she read them, a pattern emerged. They mentioned details about her life, her office, her favorite coffee shop, the color of her car. It was as if someone was watching her, tracking her every move. Amelia tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but the unease grew with each passing day. One evening, as she left the office, she thought she saw someone watching her from across the street. When she turned to look, the figure disappeared into the shadows. Shaking off the feeling, she told herself she was imagining things, but deep down she knew something wasn't right. Victor's tactics became bolder. One night, Edward came home to find their living room window shattered. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear: Victor could reach them anytime, anywhere. Edward called the police, but they found no evidence, no fingerprints, nothing to tie the incident to Victor. It was infuriating, and Edward felt powerless. Amelia, however, was beginning to put the pieces together. "Edward," she said one night, her voice trembling, "is there something you're not telling me?" Edward hesitated. He had been trying to protect her from Victor, to keep her from getting caught in the crossfire. But now, with everything escalating, he realized he couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. "There's someone," Edward admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "Someone from my past, my brother Victor. He's complicated, and now he's back." Amelia stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "You have a brother? Why didn't you tell me?" "It's not something I like to talk about," Edward replied. "Victor has always been unpredictable, dangerous. He's the kind of person who takes what he wants, no matter who gets hurt. And now he's targeting us," Amelia asked, her voice rising. "Edward, what have you gotten us into?" "I'm trying to handle it," Edward said, though even he didn't believe his own words. "I promise I'll keep you safe." But Amelia wasn't reassured. For the first time she felt like she was truly in danger, and the man she had once trusted to protect her didn't seem to have any answers. A week later, Edward received another message. This time it wasn't a note or a text, it was a video. When Edward opened it, his stomach dropped. The footage showed Amelia at her office, leaving work late at night. The camera followed her as she walked to her car, the lens zooming in on her face. There was no audio, but the message was clear: Victor was watching her. Edward slammed his laptop shut, his mind racing. He needed to act, and fast. But how could he fight someone who was always one step ahead? Someone who seemed to anticipate his every move? Meanwhile, Amelia began to connect the dots. She remembered the strange phone calls, the emails, the figure in the shadows. Suddenly, it all made sense. She confronted Edward again, demanding the full story. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I've been walking around like everything's normal while someone has been stalking me." "I didn't want to scare you," Edward said, his own voice trembling. "I thought I could handle it." "But you can't, can you?" Amelia shot back. "This isn't just about you, Edward. It's about us. It's about our safety." Edward nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right," he said softly. "I can't do this alone." As the days passed, the tension in their home became unbearable. Edward worked tirelessly to outmaneuver Victor, consulting with security experts and lawyers. Amelia, meanwhile, began taking precautions of her own, changing her routines, keeping her phone close, and watching her surroundings with a wary eye. But no matter what they did, the sense of impending doom lingered. Victor wasn't just a threat, he was a shadow looming over their lives, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And deep down, Edward and Amelia both knew that moment was coming soon. The breaking point. The breaking point. Every story has a moment where everything comes crashing down, a breaking point where decisions must be made, and the stakes become painfully clear. For Edward and Amelia, that moment came on a night they would never forget. It started with a package. Edward found it on their doorstep one morning, wrapped neatly in brown paper with no return address. Inside was a single photo, Amelia at her desk, unaware she was being watched. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note. It read, "Time's up, Edward. Meet me tonight, or you'll regret it." Edward's blood ran cold as he stared at the note. The message was clear: Victor was done playing games. This was an ultimatum, and Edward knew he couldn't ignore it. But what could he do? Meeting Victor meant walking into the lion's den, but refusing meant putting Amelia in even greater danger. That evening, Edward paced the living room, the note clutched in his hand. Amelia watched him from across the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What's going on, Edward?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You've been acting strange all day." Edward hesitated. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the worst of it, but he knew the time for half-truths was over. "Victor wants to meet," he said finally. "Tonight." Amelia's eyes widened. "Are you serious? After everything he's done, you're just going to walk into a trap?" "What choice do I have?" Edward shot back, his voice filled with frustration. "He's made it clear he won't stop until he gets what he wants." "And what is that, exactly?" Amelia asked. "What does he even want from you?" Edward ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the words. "Power. Revenge. I don't know. Victor's always hated me, hated the life I built, hated that our father trusted me more. This is just his way of tearing it all down." Amelia stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "Then don't go." Edward looked at her, his expression filled with conflict. "If I don't go, he'll come after you. I can't let that happen." Later that night, Edward drove to the location Victor had specified, a deserted warehouse on the edge of town. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Edward parked his car and stepped out, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Victor was waiting for him, leaning casually against a rusted metal beam. He smiled as Edward approached, but there was no warmth in it, only malice. "Right on time," Victor said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I knew you'd come. You're predictable like that." "Enough games," Victor, Edward said, his tone firm. "What do you want?" Victor chuckled, pushing off the beam and circling Edward like a predator sizing up its prey. "What do I want? That's a big question, little brother. But for now, let's start with this. I want you to step down. From your company, your position, everything. Hand it all over to me." Edward's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm dead serious," Victor replied. "You've had your turn. Now it's mine. And if you don't comply, well, let's just say I have ways of making you regret it." Edward's fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can threaten me into giving up everything I've worked for?" Victor smirked. "It's not just you I'm threatening, Edward. Don't forget Amelia's part of this too, and I don't think she'd handle things as well as you." The mention of Amelia made Edward's blood boil. "If you so much as touch her, you'll—" What? Victor interrupted, his voice cold. "Call the police? File a restraining order? Let's be honest, Edward, you're powerless here. You can't beat me." Meanwhile, Amelia wasn't sitting idly by. After Edward left, her instincts told her something was wrong, terribly wrong. She couldn't just wait at home, not knowing what was happening. So she called Marcus. "Marcus, I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "Edward's meeting his brother tonight, and I don't trust this situation." "Where are they meeting?" Marcus asked, his tone serious. Amelia hesitated before giving him the address. "I don't know what we'll find, but I can't just stay here and do nothing." Marcus agreed to meet her, and together they drove to the warehouse. Amelia's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if Victor hurt Edward? What if she was too late? When they arrived, Amelia and Marcus crept toward the building, staying hidden in the shadows. Through a broken window, they could see Edward and Victor, their confrontation growing more heated by the second. Inside, the tension between Edward and Victor reached a boiling point. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You don't deserve the life you have, Edward. You never did." Edward stood his ground. "You can try to take it, Victor, but you'll fail. You always do." Victor's face twisted with anger. "We'll see about that." Before Edward could react, Victor pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. "Now let's make this interesting," Victor said, his voice chillingly calm. From her hiding spot, Amelia's heart stopped. She turned to Marcus, her voice frantic. "We have to do something." Marcus nodded, his jaw set with determination. Together they burst into the warehouse, their sudden appearance catching Victor off guard. "Step away from him," Amelia shouted, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Victor turned to face her, his expression a mix of surprise and amusement. "Well, well, the little wife, how brave of you to join us." "I'm not afraid of you," Amelia said, her eyes blazing. "But you should be afraid of me." For a moment the room was silent, the tension palpable. Then, without warning, Victor lunged toward Edward. But before he could strike, Marcus tackled him to the ground, the knife skidding across the floor. Edward scrambled to his feet, grabbing the knife before Victor could reach it. He stood over his brother, his chest heaving with adrenaline. "This ends now," he said, his voice firm. As the police arrived, sirens blaring in the distance, Edward and Amelia exchanged a look of silent promise that they would face whatever came next together, but deep down, they both knew this wasn't the end. Victor wasn't the type to give up easily, and the scars of that night would linger long after the dust settled. The aftermath. After the chaos of that night, the silence felt almost deafening. The police had taken Victor away, but for Edward and Amelia, the scars of the confrontation were still raw. They sat together in their living room, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the tension that hung in the air. "I'm sorry," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at Amelia, his eyes filled with guilt. "I should have told you everything from the start. Maybe none of this would have happened." Amelia didn't respond right away. She stared at the coffee mug in her hands, her thoughts a tangled mess. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but tired. "I understand why you didn't. You thought you were protecting me. But Edward, secrets like this only make things worse." Edward nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I know," he said, "and I promise no more secrets. From now on I'll tell you everything." Amelia looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. "I need to know I can trust you again, Edward, not just with the big things but with everything." "You can," Edward said, his voice firm. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if that's what it takes." But even as they tried to rebuild their trust, the shadow of Victor loomed large. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Victor had always been resourceful and always found a way to slip through the cracks. The police might have him in custody now, but Edward knew it was only a matter of time before he found his way back into their lives. Amelia felt it too. She started double-checking the locks at night, keeping her phone close, and looking over her shoulder whenever she was out. It was exhausting, living in a constant state of vigilance, but she didn't know how to stop. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Amelia voiced the question that had been haunting her. "What if he comes back?" Edward hesitated before answering. "Then we'll be ready," he said. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect our—" But how Amelia pressed. "He's always a step ahead, Edward, always." "We'll find a way," Edward said, though his voice betrayed a hint of doubt. "We have to." Realizing they couldn't face Victor alone, Edward and Amelia decided to bring in reinforcements. Edward reached out to the private investigator he had hired earlier, asking him to dig deeper into Victor's past and connections. Meanwhile, Amelia contacted a security consultant to assess their home and implement additional protections. "We'll set up cameras, motion sensors, the works," the consultant said during his visit. "If anyone even steps onto your property, you'll know about it." And the precautions brought some comfort, but they couldn't erase the anxiety that had taken root in their lives. Every unexpected noise, every unfamiliar face, felt like a potential threat. It was like living with a storm cloud overhead, always waiting for the next bolt of lightning to strike. Throughout it all, Marcus remained a steady presence in Amelia's life. He checked in regularly, offering support and encouragement. At first, Edward was wary of Marcus, sensing the bond between him and Amelia. But over time, he realized Marcus wasn't a threat. If anything, he was an ally. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by their house to drop off some documents related to the security measures. "How are you holding up?" he asked Amelia as they stood on the porch. "I'm managing," she replied with a small smile. "Thanks for everything, Marcus. I don't know what we would have done without you." "Hey, you don't have to thank me," Marcus said. "I'm just glad you're safe." As Marcus left, Edward watched from the living room window. He felt a pang of jealousy, but it was quickly replaced by gratitude. Whatever his feelings about Marcus, he couldn't deny that the man had been there for Amelia when she needed him most. Despite the tension and fear, there were small moments of light. Edward and Amelia began spending more time together, rediscovering the connection that had been buried under years of misunderstandings and neglect. They cooked dinner together, took long walks, and talked late into the night. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Amelia turned to Edward. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" she asked. Edward thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe we don't need to. Maybe we just need to keep moving forward one day at a time." Amelia nodded, her hand finding his. "I can do that," she said softly, but even as they tried to rebuild, the specter of Victor lingered. One night, Edward received a call from the private investigator. "I've been looking into Victor's connections," the investigator said, "and I found something troubling." Edward's grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "He's not working alone," the investigator replied. "There's someone backing him, someone powerful. I don't have all the details yet, but I thought you should know." Edward's heart sank. It wasn't just Victor they had to worry about. There was a bigger threat, one they hadn't even seen coming. As he hung up the phone, Edward looked at Amelia, who was sitting on the couch, lost in thought. He didn't have the heart to tell her not yet, but he knew one thing for certain: their fight was far from over. Victor's escape and new threat. Sometimes danger doesn't just knock, it kicks down the door. For Edward and Amelia, the reprieve from Victor's presence was short-lived. They thought they were safe, but they couldn't have been more wrong. It happened 2 weeks after Victor's arrest. Edward and Amelia were just starting to feel a semblance of normalcy returning to their lives. They were having dinner when Edward's phone buzzed. It was a call from the detective handling Victor's case. "Mr. Lowell," the detective said, his tone grim, "we have a situation. Victor escaped custody during his transfer this afternoon." Edward froze, his fork clattering onto his plate. "What? How?" "We're still investigating," the detective replied, "but we believe he had outside help. I'm calling to warn you he might try to contact you." Edward's chest tightened. "You need to find him. Now." "We're doing everything we can," the detective assured him. "In the meantime, stay vigilant. And if he reaches out, let us know immediately." As Edward ended the call, his hands trembled. He looked at Amelia, who had been watching him with growing concern. "It's Victor," Edward said, his voice low. "He's out." Amelia's face paled. "How? I thought he was in custody." "He escaped," Edward said, "and he's not alone. Someone's helping him." The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and precautions. Edward increased the security measures around their home, hiring guards and installing more cameras. Amelia tried to focus on work, but her mind was constantly on edge. Every time the phone rang or the doorbell chimed, her heart raced. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Amelia finally voiced what they were both thinking. "What does he want, Edward? Why can't he just leave us alone?" Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Victor doesn't just want to hurt me, he wants to destroy me, and he'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." "But why?" Amelia asked, her voice breaking. "What did you do to make him hate you this much?" "It's not just about me," Edward admitted. "It's about our father, our family. Victor always felt like he was cast aside, like he didn't matter, and now he's taking it out on us." Victor's next move was as bold as it was chilling. Late one night, Edward received a text from an unknown number. It was a video. As he opened it, his stomach dropped. The footage showed their house, specifically their bedroom window. The camera zoomed in, capturing the light spilling out from the room. The timestamp on the video was from earlier that evening. Edward's hands shook as he showed the video to Amelia. "He was here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's watching us." Amelia covered her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We call the police," Edward said firmly, "and we don't take another step without backup." The next morning, Edward and Amelia met with the detective and their private investigator. Together, they mapped out a plan to track Victor and anticipate his next move. The investigator shared new information he had uncovered about Victor's accomplice, a man named Darrell Cross, a former associate of their father with a long history of criminal activity. "Darrell's been off the grid for years," the investigator explained, "but it looks like Victor managed to track him down. If they're working together, it's bad news." "What can we do?" Amelia asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Stay alert," the detective said. "We're increasing patrols in your neighborhood and monitoring your property, and if you see anything unusual, call us immediately." Despite their precautions, Victor found a way to get through. 2 nights later, a package arrived at their door. Inside was a small, battered notebook, the same one their father used to carry during his business dealings. Edward recognized it instantly. As he flipped through the pages, he saw cryptic notes, addresses, and dates, evidence of dealings their father had kept hidden. At the back of the notebook was a single line written in Victor's unmistakable handwriting: "You're not the only one with secrets, little brother. See you soon." Edward slammed the notebook shut, his mind racing. "He's trying to drag our father's legacy into this," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "He wants to ruin everything." Amelia placed a hand on his arm. "Then we fight back," she said firmly. "We're not letting him win." As the days went on, the tension in their lives became unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, felt like a warning. Edward and Amelia knew that Victor's next move was coming, they just didn't know when. Late one night, as they sat in the darkened living room, Amelia turned to Edward. "What if this never ends?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It will," Edward said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "One way or another, we'll end it." But as the shadows deepened around them, they couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was closer than ever, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The final showdown. Every storm has its eye, a moment of calm before chaos strikes again. For Edward and Amelia, that moment came the night Victor made his final move. It began with a phone call. Edward was in his office late at night when his phone buzzed. The number was blocked. Hesitant, he answered. "Hello?" "Hello, little brother," Victor's voice drawled on the other end, sending a chill down Edward's spine. "Miss me?" Edward clenched the phone, his jaw tightening. "What do you want, Victor?" "What I've always wanted," Victor replied. "But since you're too stubborn to hand it over, I thought I'd make things interesting." "What are you talking about?" Edward asked, his voice steady despite the unease growing in his chest. Victor chuckled. "You'll find out soon enough. Check your email." Edward hung up and quickly opened his laptop. There, in his inbox, was a single email with no subject line. Attached was a photo of Amelia, bound and gagged, sitting in what looked like an abandoned building. Beneath the photo was a single sentence: "Come alone, or she dies." Panic gripped Edward as he stared at the photo. His mind raced with questions. How had Victor gotten to Amelia? Where was she? And most importantly, how could he save her without putting her in even greater danger? He knew he should call the police, but Victor's warning echoed in his mind: "Come alone, or she dies." Edward couldn't take that risk. He grabbed his car keys and headed for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he left, he sent a single text to Marcus. "Victor has Amelia. I'm going after her. Don't call the cops. Just follow my location." Victor's chosen location was fittingly dramatic: a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. As Edward approached, the sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty space, mingling with the distant hum of the city. Edward, Victor's voice rang out, cold and mocking. "So good of you to join us." Edward stepped into the center of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the shadows. Finally he saw them: Victor standing with a knife in his hand, and behind him Amelia, tied to a chair. Her eyes widened when she saw Edward, but she couldn't speak through the gag. "Let her go, Victor," Edward said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Victor smirked. "And miss all the fun?" "I don't think so. You see, Edward, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about showing you what it feels like to lose everything." Edward took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You don't have to do this. Whatever you want, we can work something out." Victor laughed bitterly. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about making a deal. This is about revenge." Before Edward could respond, Victor lunged toward Amelia, the knife glinting in the dim light. Edward reacted instinctively, rushing forward and tackling Victor to the ground. The knife clattered across the floor as the two brothers struggled. As Edward and Victor fought, Amelia wriggled against her bindings, her heart pounding in her chest. She spotted the knife lying just a few feet away and began inching the chair toward it, using all her strength. Finally, she reached for the knife and managed to grab it with her fingers. With painstaking effort, she cut through the ropes binding her wrists and freed herself. She quickly removed the gag and stood, her eyes blazing with determination. "Edward," she shouted, tossing the knife toward him. Edward caught it just in time, holding it defensively as Victor advanced on him. The two men circled each other, their breaths heavy, their eyes locked. "You think you can beat me?" Victor sneered. "You've always been weak." Edward didn't respond. Instead, he lunged, using the knife to disarm Victor and pin him against the wall. "This ends now," Edward said, his voice firm. Just as Edward restrained Victor, the sound of sirens filled the air. Marcus burst into the warehouse, followed by the police. Victor struggled against Edward's grip, but it was no use. The officers quickly took him into custody, his threats echoing in the air as they led him away. "You haven't won," Edward Victor shouted. "This isn't over." But as the warehouse fell silent, Edward and Amelia knew they had survived the worst. Marcus approached them, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "Are you both okay?" "We are now," Edward said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. As they left the warehouse, Edward and Amelia couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. Victor was in custody, but his words haunted. This isn't over. They knew their fight might not be finished, but for now they had each other and that was enough. Resolution and rebuilding. The quiet after the storm can be just as overwhelming as the chaos itself. For Edward and Amelia, the days following Victor's arrest were a blur of relief, exhaustion, and the daunting task of putting their lives back together. The morning after the confrontation, Edward sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee in front of him. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind, the fear in Amelia's eyes, the rage in Victor's voice, the moment he realized how close he had come to losing everything. Amelia joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked softly. Edward shook his head. "I keep thinking about what could have happened. If Marcus hadn't shown up, if you hadn't freed yourself," his voice trailed off, the words too painful to say out loud. "But none of that happened," Amelia said firmly. "We're here, we're safe, and Victor's gone." Edward looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt. "You shouldn't have had to go through any of this, Amelia. It's my fault." "It's not your fault," Amelia replied, her voice steady. "Victor made his choices. You can't take responsibility for his actions." As the days turned into weeks, Edward and Amelia began to rebuild not just their home but also their relationship. The ordeal had exposed the cracks in their foundation, but it had also reminded them of the strength they could find in each other. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Edward turned to Amelia. "I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry for everything. The secrets, the distance. I let my past come between us." Amelia reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We can't change the past, Edward, but we can decide what to do with the future." Edward nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And what does our future look like?" "Stronger," Amelia said simply. "Together." For Amelia, the experience had been transformative. She had always thought of herself as strong, but Victor's threats had tested her in ways she never expected. Now she felt a newfound sense of confidence, a belief that she could face whatever life threw at her. At work, she poured her energy into her boutique content creation firm, taking on new challenges and stepping into a leadership role she had once shied away from. Her team noticed the change. "You're on fire lately, Lisa," her assistant said one afternoon. "What's your secret?" Amelia smiled. "Just realizing how much I'm capable of." Despite their progress, the shadow of Victor still lingered. Edward and Amelia couldn't ignore the fact that he had vowed revenge, and his words haunted them both. The police assured them that Victor was in custody, but Edward couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the end. One day, Edward received a call from the detective. "We've been looking into Victor's network," the detective said, "and we've uncovered something troubling." Edward's grip on the phone tightened. "What is it?" "Victor's accomplice, Darrell Cross. He's still out there," the detective replied. "We believe he's working on Victor's behalf. You need to stay vigilant." Edward relayed the news to Amelia, and together they doubled down on their security measures. They knew they couldn't let their guard down, but they refused to let fear dictate their lives. Amelia suggested they take a trip, a chance to escape the reminders of Victor and focus on each other. Edward agreed, and they spent a weekend in a small coastal town, walking along the beach and rediscovering the joy of simply being together. On their last night, as they watched the waves crash against the shore, Amelia turned to Edward. "Do you think we'll ever stop looking over our shoulders?" Edward thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know, but I do know this: we've faced the worst together, and no matter what happens, we'll keep facing it together." Amelia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "That's all I need." As they returned home, a sense of peace settled over them. But in the shadows far away, a figure watched their every move. Victor's accomplice, Darrell, sat in a dimly lit room, a smirk playing on his lips as he studied a map pinned to the wall. The words scrawled across it were chilling: "This isn't over." For now, Edward and Amelia chose to focus on the life they were rebuilding. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they were stronger together. And as they faced the uncertain future, they held on to one simple truth: no matter what came next, they would face it side by side.